How we doing? My name's Kurt. I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm thrilled that you are joining us, whether you're here in the room or you're watching online, wherever you're tuning in from. Thanks for spending part of your Sunday with us. We are in week 2 of a series we started last week. That's why it's week 2, called OGs of the OT, the original gangsters of the Old Testament. And it's fun as we were thinking through all these different characters from the Hebrew Scriptures and people that maybe you've kind of heard of, maybe never fully embraced or understood their full story. There were so many to choose from, so we thought, we'll start the series off with something that everyone's heard of, Abraham, so we did that one. And then today, we're kind of diving into maybe a lesser-known character in the Old Testament, but yet a profound one nonetheless that teaches us an incredible lesson through her life, and her name was Deborah. And so in a moment, we're going to get into it, but I have a question to kind of kick us off as we think about this story. And wherever you're at on your spiritual journey, I don't know where all of you find yourself. Maybe you say, I'm a committed Christian, and I'm trying to do the best I can to live my life according to the ways and teachings of Jesus, and God is my first priority, right? Maybe that would be how you would define yourself. Maybe you're like, I'm not so sure about this whole God thing, but I was promised brunch afterwards, so I came to church. So maybe someone took Julie up on the bribe idea. So you might find yourself like, I'm pretty skeptical. I'm not so sure. Maybe you would find yourself somewhere in the middle. You're like, God, maybe probably exists, but I'm not totally sure what to do with that or what God's even like. Or I've heard lots of different stories and lots of different perspectives, but I don't know which one is real, and I don't know what that means for me. But no matter where you're at, kind of any of those three or anywhere in between on your spiritual journey, for a moment, I would love for you to consider that if God exists and if God actually cares enough about your personal life, that there is a plan and a purpose, and there's something that God might have for you, not just for the world ethereally, but specifically and personally, uniquely for you. If that's true, would you want to get all that God's got for you? If God, I got a soft yes right here in the middle. Perfect, great. So the rest of you still thinking about it, totally fine. Wasn't meant to be answered, but I appreciate the rhetorical question. So if you believe that God has got something for you, right? Even if it feels like a far-fetched idea, would you want to get all of that? And if there was a way to make sure that whatever God has for you, you don't miss out on it, would you want to take those steps? And I think for all of us at some level, regardless of where we find ourselves on the spiritual spectrum, we would say, yeah, if that's true, and if what God has for me is personal and is special and is even good, I would want to make sure I get all of that and I don't leave anything on the table. We were on a cruise a couple weeks ago, and it was one of those things where you go on a vacation where you're on a boat for 2 days, and our kids, we usually try to keep things pretty healthy in our house and have pretty regular eating times. But our boys specifically, we have 3 kids, Selah, who's 8.5, Leighton, who's 7, and Isaiah, who's 4.5. Our boys specifically have this terrible habit of wanting a snack about 30 minutes before mealtime, right? It's just my kids, anybody else, right? It's 5 o'clock, dinner is being prepared, and they're like, I want a snack, and they just find it in the cabinet, right? And so on a cruise, that's great, because there's food everywhere at all times, and so we're like, sure. And now we're kind of back reacclimating into real life, and we're trying to break bad habits that we started. But it was one of those things where, there was just always something there, and they kept wanting to try new things, which was great, because if you didn't like it, you didn't have to finish it. But then learning that in our own life back home has been a challenge for them to kind of get back into normalcy. And it's that idea, though, as a kid, you're like, no, I want to try it. Why not? I want to go for it. Why leave anything untested? Why leave anything on the table, right? And I think that's a space for many of us when it comes to our faith, that often we can get so sidetracked or distracted or even just stuck in a rhythm of religious routine that we think we understand all that God has for us as if we've already achieved it. And yet for what we're going to learn today is that actually there is more. No matter where you're at on your spiritual journey, there's more that God has for you, and I think there's more that God might even be wanting to invite you to step into today and make a change in your life, as we're going to see in the life of this ancient hero named Deborah. So last week we talked about this kind of pervasive problem that plays into the story of Deborah as kind of the backstory, that no matter where you find yourself in history, this idea shows up consistently, and that is that we are forgetful, but God is faithful, right? That so many of our own lives, our own story, certainly the story of the Israelite people in the Old Testament, they were forgetful, but God was faithful. And so after the time of Abraham, as we talked about last week, God promised that he's going to be a great nation, which, again, his first question was, what's a nation? And so God led him out of his homeland, away from his family, and then times were kind of crazy for a long period of time. There was times of peace, and then there was times where the people that were Abraham's descendants were captured and overthrown. They were enslaved for 400 years. A guy named Moses shows up, leads them out of captivity in Egypt. You've seen the Disney movie. And so there's this moment where then this kind of generational thing begins to happen, and people find themselves as a part of this nation. And after a long time with Moses, as they're wandering around in the wilderness, they're never kind of finding home. They finally are led into the land that God had promised them, that they had been looking forward to for generations and generations, under a guy named Joshua. And Joshua is an incredible hero, incredible war leader, and he was who kind of followed after Moses. And many of us have experienced this in our own life, that after there's a great leader, it becomes very easy to assume that leadership is easy, because they make it look so easy, right? And so they followed Joshua, and it was just like, oh, this is incredible. Like, after such a great leader, like, maybe this is just something we can figure out on our own. And so we pick up in Judges chapter 2 as we enter a new phase in the life of the Israelite people after the time of captivity with Moses and Joshua, what they call the forefathers era. And now we're stepping into the Judges era. All right, so if you have a Bible, you can turn to Judges chapter 2 in the seat back pocket directly in front of you. If you're in the room with us today, there's a Bible in this blue Bible. It's on page 146. I would encourage you to grab that. If you're watching online, open up another tab, search for Judges chapter 2, and it kind of gives us the backstory that leads up into where we're going to pick up today. So in Judges chapter 2, starting in verse 7, it says this: "And the Israelites served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the leaders who outlived him," right? So Joshua has set up this incredible leadership structure where everyone knew what they were doing, and there was a great time of peace, right? Those who had seen all the great things that the Lord had done for Israel. Then Joshua, son of Nun, in case you were curious which one, that Joshua, right? The servant of the Lord died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the land that he had been allocated at Timor Serah in the hill country of Ephraim. I can't pronounce that for some reason. Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. And after that generation died, another generation grew up. And this is important. Who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things he had done for Israel. After that generation that Joshua led, where everyone remembered, it was not a story to them. It was something they had experienced, where God had led them through times of uncertainty and had been faithful to his promise. When there was dead ends, they didn't know how they were going to do it. God made a way. They knew that. They were there. They had that dirt on their feet when they walked those paths. But then the next generation, who did not experience it for themselves, grew up and did not acknowledge those things and the mighty things that the Lord had done for Israel. And so they do what all of us do when we forget what God has done. When we don't have a faith experience of our own, we tend to find whatever is most accessible, right? And so the Israelites did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the things he had done for them. They did evil in the Lord's sight because they served images of Baal. What that means is just idols of other gods, right? They abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt, and they went after other gods, worshiping the gods of people around them. And this angered the Lord, right? Because you've had this experience before, right? You help someone out, and then they forget what you've done for them, and then they come back asking for something more. It's called parenting. But, you have had those experiences where it feels like you just can't do enough for somebody at work or your boss or a neighbor or whatever. And this is what the writer of Judges is recounting, looking back probably a couple generations later, saying, I remember these stories where these things happened, where we got distracted from what God was wanting to do in our life. And because we hadn't experienced something ourselves, because, don't miss this, we had relied on the faith of someone else, whether that's a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, a friend, a college roommate, or a faith of a previous version of you, right? That there is this sense that idea, that realness, that connection to what God is actively doing begins to decay. And so I just reach for whatever's accessible. I just reach for whatever's most comfortable. I reach for whatever is closest or most loud in my life that can easily take my distraction away from the things that I know God might have for me, right? We all said at the beginning that if God has something for you, wouldn't you want to get all that God's got for you? And yet so many of us fall into this same story, this same distraction where we can so easily forget what God has done because it's a past tense story. So my question for you and for me is the story that God is writing in your life, is it only past tense or is it present tense? When was the last time you saw God use you and do something powerful through your life or move on your behalf? As we talked about last week with Abraham, where are you moving your feet as you pray? That there's a projection and a progress in your life that you are anticipating and even, I would say, expecting God to move in a powerful way so that your faith remains fresh. Because this was the story where the Hebrew people were. They had forgotten, and their kids grew up not understanding that God was still wanting to move. For those of you that are parents, is the story that you talk to your kids about faith, is it just that, oh, this is a religious tradition that we do? Or do we remind them that God actually wants to do something powerful in and through their story as well? That God isn't waiting for them to grow up to try and remember something that used to happen, but that God wants to do something new now in your life and theirs as well. And so this is the situation. And so what happens is that there's this moment where all of a sudden what used to work isn't working anymore. And so rather than just being left to themselves, there's this idea of let's bring up judges, these people that are kind of prophets, kind of leaders, military as well as spiritual leaders in the community of Israel, right? To remind them of what God has done. And so as they kind of left their bearings and they started worshiping other gods, the history tells us that there became this huge time of economic collapse, that they were invaded and the people of Israel were being oppressed by the kingdom of Jabin and his powerful general named Sisera, that it was so dangerous in their homeland that they couldn't even leave their homes. Again, this is ancient history, not what you saw on the news this week, right? This is a story that we pick ourselves up in. And so jump down to Judges chapter 4, and it gives us a little more context as Deborah steps onto the scene. It says in Judges chapter 4, starting in verse 4, Sisera, who's the commander of the oppressive army of Jabin, who has taken over the nation of Israel, had 900 chariots, all right? These are the F-22s of her time, right? Had 900 iron chariots and ruthlessly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. It took them 20 years to remember that God wanted to do something in their life under this pain of oppression. And so finally it says the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help. And Deborah, the wife of Lapidoth, was a prophet who was judging Israel at the time. So before she steps up to lead the country and to lead the community of Israel, she was a prophet. She was the only judge that was considered a prophet as well that would speak on behalf of God. It says she would sit out under the palm of Deborah, right, which is obviously written later because that's what they called it. But when she was there, it was probably just that palm tree over there. But it became known as the palm of Deborah, between Ramon and Bethel in the hill country and Ephraim. And the Israelites would go out to her for judgment. Now, you might be wondering, in modern culture, why would you pursue judgment? That's something we try to avoid. What that means is that they would go out there to have their disputes settled. They trusted her wisdom, they trusted her heart to listen, and they trusted her connection to God. Right? This was a powerful thing, especially in this incredibly patriarchal culture of ancient Israel, that there would be a woman that would be seen as the rightful leader of the nation. And so she is out there, and one day she sent for Barak, son of Abinadab, to live in Kadesh, to go in the land of Naphtali, right? I love Old Testament because it really makes me work on my pronunciation. And she said to him, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you to do, right? And again, I love that she reminds him who she's talking about, right? The Lord, the God of Israel, the one that we're supposed to be following. This is what he says. Call out to 10,000 warriors from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun in Mount Tabor, and I will call out to Sisera, commander of Jabin's army, along with his chariots and warriors, and call them to the Kishon River, and there I will give you victory over him. So what she basically says is, I know they have almost 1,000 chariots and like, let's get all the foot soldiers we have, which is about 10,000. So the assumption is in old time when we had like these armies that if you had a chariot, you would also have 100 infantry people alongside of them. That was typical ratios, right? So if they have 1,000 chariots, what they're basically, scholars say, is they're going up against 10-1 odds in this battle. They're going up against 10-1 odds. And she says, you go get all the people we can, like call all our friends, right? Gather everybody up because we're going to need the help. And I'm going to call out and command this general, Sisera, to come out and fight, right? Which was an incredibly bold move. And I love Barak's honesty, right? Barak told her, I will go, but only if you go with me. Which we can give people in the Bible a tough rap. Like, oh, why wouldn't you have faith to just do it? Because it was 10-1 odds, right? And you and I would do the same thing. He was wise, right? He wasn't trying to go out and get himself and his people killed. He goes, I'll go, but if you really believe that this is what God's called us to do, I want you to come with me. I don't want to just go out there on my own. And Deborah replies, very well, I will go with you. But you will receive no honor in this venture, for the Lord's victory over Sisera will be in the hands of a woman. Now, again, this can feel kind of aggressive, but really all she's saying is we know the times we live in. And the fact that I'm even asking you to do something is already unique. But what I love about this passage is that nowhere in this passage, and continuing the story of Deborah, do we see Barak or any of the other leaders in Israel at the time questioning her leadership. That within the first few generations of the story of the people of God, that there were women that were elevated to the positions of leadership and authority, and that was something that men played well with. I think this is a really important thing for us to remember in our time when it's so easy for men to kind of grab the Mojo Dojo Casa House situation and try to take on their place in the world by putting other people down. And what I love about this passage is that there was never this moment where he's saying, you have to come with me because, you can't do it on your own. But in fact, it was quite the opposite. That there was an honor, there was a belief, there was a respect given to Deborah, again, who very clearly was a woman. There's no mistake about that, to say, hey, I actually need your leadership here. And so for those of you in this room that are male, and if you would be honest, you have a hard time respecting or following and honoring the leadership of women in your life, I think perhaps that's a space that you might be missing out on what God might have for you. That if you really want to get all that God's got for you, you get it from wherever God might send it your way. But for many of us, we've limited ourselves of who we can hear from God from because we have our own decisions and our own perspective. But luckily for Barak, that was not the case in this story. He says, I will go, but only if you go with me. He wasn't worried about receiving the honor and having his own standing in history. He just wanted to make sure his people were free. And so she says, this is going to be a unique story in the timeline of our people, that a victory of this magnitude will be led by the hands of a woman. And so Deborah went out with Barak to Kadesh. And at Kadesh, Barak called together the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 warriors went up with him. And Deborah also went with him. And then what we see in Judges 5 is this recounting of this story, this battle where Deborah was not only the only woman to lead, but she led to an incredible, incredible victory. And I love that as the author of Judges recounts her life and her story, that there is this sense in which Deborah could have been easily put on the same pedestal as others who were just military generals. But what we see is that she's the only judge out of all of these judges that led Israel, who is also called a prophet, one who sat and listened to the people and listened and spoke for God. She was a civic leader, a judicial leader, a spiritual leader, and a military leader. She's the Pope, the President, and Rambo all in one, right? This is an incredible, incredible ancient hero that teaches us a couple things that I think are really, really important for us as we look to her story. Because not only did she lead this incredible battle and led the nation of Israel to peace for over 40 years, which was twice as long as the second most successful judge of the 5 who ruled Israel after Joshua. But how she did it was unique. What Deborah showed us is that great leadership starts with great listening. If you want to lead your kids, if you want to lead your team at work, if you want to lead in any capacity that is worth following, you have to start with listening. That there's a sense in which understanding what the person you're trying to lead feels, sees, needs, and wants from you is a really, really important step of leadership. That long before she called Barak and said, here's what you need to do, she was getting a pulse of the people of Israel. Are we ready for this? Is this something that is wise to do? It will always be a risk, that we know for sure. It will always be treacherous to stand up to oppression. It will always be dangerous to put your neck out there and speak up for what is right. That is always true. That's inevitable. But is this something that we are ready for as a community? Is it something that we are wise to do? This is what good leaders do, is that they listen. They listen to themselves, they listen to other people, and they ultimately listen to God. And I think that's why Deborah was able to lead the nation of Israel to such prolonged peace, is because that habit was formed long before she had any power. That her position was not one of holding the sword or standing in the castle, but it was sitting under a palm tree outside of town, welcoming people into her presence. And this model, this posture of servant leadership, not only gained her notoriety, but helped people trust her, so much so that Barak was like, hey, I'm willing to do what you ask, but please come with me. Please be there with me. I wonder for you in your life, those that you're trying to lead, and you might be thinking, I'm not much of a leader, but I guarantee you there are people in your life that are watching you, that are looking to you for leadership in your classroom or in your home, in your neighborhood or on your sports team. That there are people that are looking to you for leadership. And would you be willing to be the kind of leader who's willing to listen? To rather than grasp for your own honor, to actually empower others to do it because you listened to them. That's the second thing we see from Deborah's leadership, is not only was she a listening leader, she was an empowering leader. That at first she wasn't necessarily taking the reins to do it herself, but because she was so trusted, because she had listened, that when she gave away power, she actually was invited to continue to step in. That we see what happens when she leads this army to go against 10-1 odds to free their people, is that she's invited to take that rightful place at the head because she was willing to sit in the back, because she was willing to give the position to another. I wonder in your life, in my own life, this is challenging. I'm saying, where am I wanting to grab for my own honor, and where am I willing to empower others and lift them up? Am I willing to listen? Am I willing to empower and lift up other people? These are incredible lessons that we see in the life and leadership of Deborah. And then in Judges 5, the author of Judges records this whole chapter is the song of victory from Deborah. And you see that this is so incredible, that this wasn't something that was just projected backwards onto her, because it's always easy to rewrite history in a brighter light than it was when it happened. But this song was recorded that had been passed down from generation to generation as the song of Deborah. And in Judges 5, verses 6 and 7, it says this: in the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, which is just giving us history, and in the days of Jael, the highways were abandoned. Travelers took the winding paths, and the villagers in Israel would not fight. They held back. And again, this was the story. Everyone was hiding in their homes. They weren't willing to go outside. Everyone was hiding away in fear. Until I, Deborah, arose. Until I arose, a mother in Israel. And I love that her title that she gives herself isn't a leader in Israel, although she was, isn't a general in Israel, although she certainly was, isn't even a prophetess in Israel, although that was a title given to her. Her title that she gave herself was a mother in Israel. The posture that she took, the perspective that she took in her leadership was that I am mothering this community. That brings space of protection, space of provision, a space of correction, a space of wisdom, that she first and foremost saw herself in a relational context. But she tells us that everyone had given up. Everyone had given up on being their own country. Everyone had given up on the promises of God. And I think if she were to translate her song into our context, she would encourage us, hey, remember, even when times are tough, even when things aren't going the way that you thought, even when you can't see your way out, and even when everyone else has given up or left you or abandoned the goal, Deborah would say, keep your faith in God, even if you've lost your faith in people. I know for some of us in our own story, I know many of your stories, that there's times when the people that maybe even spoke for God had hurt you. There's times and spaces where you've tried to trust again and it's been let down. There's places in your life where the deepest wounds that you carry into a morning like this are relational ones. And I think that it's no accident that one of the most powerful leaders in this season of history in the Israelites, one that we often don't hear much about besides her, postured herself and positioned herself with a relational title for a reason. Because she was a prophetess, because she was close to God, she understood that even when the Old Testament feels like it's just a bunch of war and fighting, and I can be as off-put by that as perhaps you are as well, that she interjects the perspective of God into this story as a relational being, as one that binds and pulls together, as one that looks out for those that cannot look out for themselves. And I wonder if the problem that you're facing, the tension that you might be wrestling with, the thing that feels broken or falling apart, the space where you felt abandoned, what if the solution to that problem in your life, just as it was in Deborah's life, isn't one that's done through power or posturing, but is actually done through relationship? That the solution to the problem that you might be facing is one of seeing yourself in a deeper, more connected, relational posture. Because here's what's powerful about Deborah's life is not only did she bring relational connection to others around her, not only did she ultimately bring victory, but she did it in a way that was postured to serve. That as we see in the Old Testament, hundreds and hundreds of years before the idea of a Messiah would even really rise to collective consciousness for them, they were still trying to get organized as a community. We see characteristics of Jesus in the life of Deborah. We see servant leadership. We see boldness. We see an empowerment. We see a connection to the divine as well as to humanity, that we are invited to model our life after just as she did. And I wonder for you, where is the space in your life where you need to be more available, more accessible, under a palm tree, listening to those in your leadership? I talked to a guy in our church even just a couple weeks ago that he simply set up an hour of time at the end of each week at 4 o'clock on Friday where he has like office hours on Zoom. His company's still mostly virtual. And he said from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock on Thursdays or Fridays, whatever day it was, I'm available. And you just drop in and talk about anything you need. Talk about your family. Talk about anything about our job, our culture. There's nothing project-oriented allowed in that 1 hour on Zoom. It's just connection. And he did that about a year ago, and he said the culture of their company, and specifically his team, has become something remarkable, meaning people talk about it because he made himself available. And as I read this passage, I go, yeah, that's what he did, is he created a palm tree. He created a space where he was just accessible and available. Where in your life maybe do you need to do that for your kids or for your neighbors or for those on your team or for those that work for you at your company? Where can you create a space where you're simply available to listen, knowing that leadership is built on listening? Where in your life do you need to empower others to come alongside you? I'll be honest, this is a tough one for me, right? Because there's ways that I see I want things to go and I want them to happen, and sometimes it's just easier to do it myself. And I'm so challenged by the leadership of Deborah to say, hey, where in your life do you need to actually empower other people to do it their way, not your way? And let them invite you in if they want to. Let them invite you to be a part of it. And the final thing I want to challenge you with the life of Deborah that challenges me is she was not willing to stand by and let somebody else take it. While for 20 years she governed through servant leadership sitting under the palm tree, the moment that we are taught to remember Deborah by her own song is the moment she decided to step in rather than stand by. That there was a moment where she said, this is what the Lord has said. This is what I know God's inviting us to do, and I'm going to lead our people to do it, not knowing the outcome, even though there are incredible odds. And perhaps in your life, there's an invitation from the Lord this morning through this story of this incredible woman asking you, are you willing to step in rather than just stand by? Maybe there's a challenge that needs to be solved. There's a relational rift in your family or at work. Maybe there's something in your finances that you've been kind of just hoping if we just don't look at it, it'll go away and resolve itself on its own, right? Maybe there's something in your parenting or something even with your faith that you know there's a hurdle. There's something that's keeping you from getting all that God has for you. And you hope with enough time and there's enough patience or enough just waiting around that God will solve it for you. And if you were honest, that has been your posture maybe for weeks or months or even years when it comes to the story of your faith. And this morning, I wonder if the story of Deborah, through the story of Deborah, if ultimately the Spirit of God is whispering to your soul saying, hey, that thing you've been waiting for me to do, it's actually yours. It's actually yours. Are you willing to step in rather than stand by? To step in and honor that person and offer forgiveness. To step in and to ask the question that you've been afraid to ask because it's easier to stay in your cynicism and your assumptions. To step in and offer to help that person that you know is struggling in your neighborhood or in your family. To step in and take that leap to ask for that promotion or to start that company. To step in and invite that person to join you in your faith journey, whether that's coming to church or just having a conversation about God. Rather than just standing by, waiting, hoping that it'll happen on its own, that God's inviting us, inviting you in your specific area of life to step in and be a leader like Deborah, because none of us want what Deborah had to experience. None of us want a generation to grow up, our kids, our neighbors, the next generation in our own country and community, that remembers faith as something of the past. And if you're my age or younger, can I be honest with you? We are that generation. By no fault of their own, many of our parents taught us that faith was something, or the experiences that we had, whether it was parents or others, taught us that faith was something they used to do. Back in the good old days in the 60s when faith mattered. And you hear this narrative even today in churches. And it never works because it's not how God works. And so the question is for you and for me, are we willing to step in rather than stand by? Are we willing to grab a hold and have a faith of our own? That the faith of our friends, the faith of our parents, while important in our legacy, cannot sustain you into getting all that God's got for you. And so are you willing to step in rather than just stand by and watch? And I don't know what that specific situation is in your story. I know for a fact that if you think hard enough, all of us can find some area where that idea applies. It's that thing that's rising in your chest like, oh, I hope he's not talking about that. I'm not, but maybe the Holy Spirit is reminding you that's what he's talking about. Maybe that's the thing that you need to take a step, to lean in, to say, I'm willing to risk a little bit, and I'm willing to lead. And I think this idea can be really scary because we always assume that's beyond us. And that's what I love about Deborah, is she recognized, hey, it doesn't take a position and it doesn't take a battle to be a leader. Deborah was seen as a leader long before any of the things that we recognize about her story. She was leading. She was seen as a respectable leader in her community because she was listening, because she was empowering, and because she was willing to take a step in. And my question is, are you and I willing to do those same three things? Because if you do, over time, the perception of your leadership will naturally rise in your community, in your family, in your workplace, and even in our church, because that's how humans work. That's how God has designed us, is that when we see people that are willing to listen, that don't need to grab a hold of all the credit, but are willing to step out in courage, those are people we want to follow. And that's not just for the spiritual elite, right? That's not just for those that start companies or lead countries. That's for you and for me, right where you are today, because this is what we learn. This is the incredible lesson from this ancient hero. That when everything was stacked against her, not just in the military opposition of the oppressive government, but simply by being a woman in her generation, Deborah had everything stacked against her, and yet she heard the voice of God calling her to something higher. And when we step into our calling, it actually calls other people higher as well. That when you and I take the risk to say, I'm going to obey God and step into what he has for me, it rises all the tide. And others around us see that there's something that they might have in their life, that God might have specifically, uniquely for them, that they can step into because they watched your example. If your kid's faith looks just like yours, would you want any more for them? If your future kid's faith looks just like yours, would you want any more for them? If your neighborhood did family and understood what God had for them the way you do your family, would there be more? If the people in your company had integrity and honored each other and lived above reproach the way you do, would there be anything left on the table? Or would you get all that God has for you? Would you get all that God has for your family? Would you get all that God has for your company? Would we get all that God has for our church? I think for all of us, and I'll be honest, this includes me, there's an invitation to raise the bar, to step into what God might have for us, to not hold back and wait another day, but to say, God, with your help, by your power, I want to listen, I want to share the responsibility, but I don't want to miss what you're inviting me into. I want to step into what you have planned for me because I want all that God's got for me. How about you? So let me pray for us. Let me pray that God might be doing something in us. And this wouldn't just be information that we heard one Sunday, but it would actually spur on and ignite something in our story, that our faith would move just like it did in the life of Deborah, that changed a generation, and it can change one again. Let's pray together. God, thank you so much for the privilege of being invited by you into a unique journey for every single one of us. That what you have for me isn't what you have for everyone, but you have a unique plan and journey for all of us. But it invites all of us to take hold and to step in to what it is that you've invited us into. God, thank you for the incredible example of this ancient hero, that against insurmountable odds, internal and external, she simply said yes to you. She didn't think she had it all figured out. She didn't think she was the answer to everyone's prayers, but she knew that you were faithful if she would move. And so I pray for those in this room that they have an insurmountable odd ahead of them, whether that's something they're struggling with their own mental health, seeing how they see themselves, whether that's a financial burden that they just can't seem to get past, whether it's a relational rift that they wish would go away, but if they were honest, they haven't done much more than wish, whether it's a dream you've placed in their heart that they've been afraid to take a step of faith to pursue, or whether it's trusting ultimately that you have something more for them in their life. God, I pray that today we would remember who it is that is inviting us. That it's not just the universe out there that's distant and disconnected, but it's the God of Israel, the one who keeps his promises, that is beckoning us to step into, play our unique part in this time and space in history. That our families, our futures, and that our faith would grow to know that you want to continue to write a story in their life, and that we would not forget what you used to do, because it would be so active and so new and so consistent in our life that we see you move in and through each and every one of us. God, ultimately, we know that there are things that, just like in the story of Deborah, that only you can do on our behalf. We don't know how it's going to happen, but what we can do is trust you with the first step. And so I pray that today, through this incredible woman and her story, we would be reminded, and that we would not be forgetful, but we would remember who you are and what you've invited us into. We pray this in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen and amen. I'm so glad you're here today. We are going to continue our worship gathering together by singing a few songs to help us remember who it is that we're worshiping, to remember who it is that has invited us to take these steps. But before we sing, we want to continue in our worship by giving back to God. For those of you that call Restoration Church home, this is an incredible way that we actually take a step towards what God is inviting us to do, to actually make sure that the faith that we have isn't stopping with us, but it's passed along to the next generation, whether that's children or to neighbors, next generation of faith that have yet to find our church or yet to find a relationship with Jesus, that we want to invest in that potential future in spite of the incredible odds that we may face. And we do that by giving a portion of our hard-earned money towards the mission of this church. And so if you came prepared to give today, this is a great time to do that. We're so grateful for your participation and your generosity. If you're here for the first time, please don't feel any obligation to give. None of us give out of obligation anyway. We give out of joy as an opportunity to be a part of what God is doing in a small way. So we try to make it really easy. There's 3 ways you can give. You can go to restorationchurchsd.com/give, set up one-time or reoccurring giving. That's how most of our church does it. It helps us stay consistent by automating what's important. You can give the kiosks or the giving boxes on your way out as you leave today, or you can grab your cell phone and text any amount to the number 84321, or scan the QR code on the screen behind me. You'll get a text response back. You can choose Restoration Church as your giving destination. But however it is that you choose to give, we just again want to say thank you for being a part of what God is doing here, that your generosity and participation moves the faith of the past into the future in powerful, powerful ways. So thank you. Well, we're going to sing together, so I invite you to stand if you're able. The words will be up on the screen. But let's just remember, again, who it is that we talk about when we talk about this God that invites us to follow him, invites us to take steps of faith, invites us to pursue something bigger that we couldn't do on our own, but that we can do with his help together. So let's stand together and sing. Thanks for being here today.